Everyone to the Center for Social Media Visiting Scholars Series. We're very lucky today to have David Karpf, who is a professor at George Washington University and the School of Media and Public Affairs, and a wonderful scholar who has just written a new book called The Move On Effect, The Unexpected Transformation of American Political Advocacy, which I highly recommend. It was published with Oxford University. And a couple of other things about Dave. He has a PhD in political science from Penn, and was a fellow at the Yale ISP and a number of other accolades, and also has experience as an activist. So he has a very interesting perspective on this, and I want to thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. It is great to see you all. I have given talks before at GW and at Georgetown, so I feel like now I've collected all three for DC. Do I get a mug or something at the end of it? Is there like...
You do Trinity and Marymount.
Trinity and Marymount? And, okay. But there is a mug at the end of that, right?
Toaster.
Okay, toaster, yeah. I'm also, there's like 3 more Ivies I need to give talks at, and then I'm positive I get a sweater. Somebody somewhere told me that's how it worked, and I believed them. So yeah, thanks for having me. This is the book. This was originally the dissertation. A little bit of background on how this came up. As Laura mentioned, before I got into academia, I was in the advocacy world. I got involved with the Sierra Club actually back when I was 16 years old, living in Montgomery County, Maryland, just up the Red Line, and stayed involved with that organization through my 30s, and ended up on their board of directors while I was in graduate school, which for graduate students in the room, don't do that. Do not join national boards of directors while you're in graduate school. Not the best use of your time. But it ended up providing a really interesting perspective because being on that board of directors, I got to see how the discussions that we were having about how is the internet changing advocacy for us. And rather than the discussions that were happening in academia, primarily about things like Facebook and how Facebook changes organizing without organizations, instead we're having a very different set of discussions about what happens to organizations when you've got these new communications technologies. And that ended up inspiring the research project that is now this book. So in general, I would suggest that today we've got 3 big competing perspectives on online collective action. And the first is that notion that the internet is driven organizing without organizations. This is most notably and charismatically offered by Clay Shirky. That's after the colon of his book. But it's also coming from the scholarly community. So Jennifer Earle and Katrina Kimport wrote this book just last year, Digitally Enabled Social Change. They're making the same argument, that they're saying that thanks to the internet, we now see not only the supersizing of existing activism, but also what they call Theory 2.0, or activism that no longer needs organizations in order to succeed in its goals. We've then got a second theme running through. This is the notion that, sure, there's organizing without organizations, that's what's happened, but that's a problem, that's a bad thing, because it leads to clicktivism. And in particular, Malcolm Gladwell, of course, said this most strongly. Evgeny Morozov has said it a little bit, mostly in the international context. Stu Schulman, who was at University of Massachusetts Amherst, also made this argument that, yeah, now it's become so much easier to click on things, but that carries some hidden costs that we need to be aware of. And the third argument is that it's still an elite-dominated system, and that really, while we've changed communication technologies, the fundamental characteristics haven't changed at all. That's Matthew Heinemann, who's now my colleague at George Washington. Also, Schlotzman, Verba, and Brady in their recent book, The Unheavenly Chorus. What they're arguing is that if you look at the mass participatory level, really it's still an elite system, and mass behavior hasn't changed because of online comments. The same biases that were present before are still present now. I want to argue for a fourth perspective, which is what I call organizing with different organizations. So the book is about this generation shift amongst advocacy groups. And this photo, and also the cover photo, is Wisconsin. Incidentally, the first book talk that I got to give was at University of Wisconsin-Madison. That was a little bit weird. It was like, okay, so can anyone picture themselves in the photo? And someone was like, I think I'm in the bottom left corner, that's me. But we saw these Madison protests crop up 2 Februarys and Marches ago. And when that happened, no one said, and this was funny because the Arab Spring had just happened. We looked at the Arab Spring and people said, is it a Twitter revolution? Actually, I didn't find many cases of people saying it is a Twitter revolution, but we saw abundant cases of people saying it is not a Twitter revolution, stop calling it that. I'm not sure who was calling it that to begin with. There was no discussion like that around Wisconsin, though. No one thought that Twitter caused the Wisconsin protests. And that's because we have a received model for how to understand those protests, which is this is a labor policy dispute in America. We know how this goes. But in particular, what I want to suggest to you is that that protest, and we know that it began as a local response to a state policy dispute. This was about the Budget Rescissions Act that was going through the state legislature. And we know how those usually go in the past 20 or 30 years. Generally speaking, labor loses, and they lose pretty quick. And this turned out differently. And one of the things that was a feature of that protest action was that after it started as that local protest moment, not only did national labor get involved, but so did what we call the Netroots. So this new generation of political advocacy groups, not new generation of activists, the people who were involved with Move On and Democracy for America, they're in their 50s and 60s, whereas the people in the Sierra Club are in their 60s and 70s. So there hasn't been a radical change in the age of people involved. Schlotzman, Verba, and Brady are right about that. But there is a change in the types of organizations that get involved and how they get involved. So these Netroots organizations, Move On in particular, within 2 days, pivoted from what they had been working on, the national issues they had been focusing on, and turned attention to Wisconsin. Within 2 weeks, Move On had organized, amongst a coalition of partners, protests in all 49 other state capitals happening on a Saturday, which got over 50,000 people turning out. And that helped to nationalize that conflict and keep it going, so that was where our attention turned for those weeks. So Netroots organizations play a central role in the nationalization of this conflict, which is then important for how it all works out. That conflict works out differently if it's just the teachers' unions yelling at Scott Walker while a bunch of state Democrats have fled the state and we're trying to find them. That works very differently if that's just a minor issue than if it's the lead story in all the national papers. If we want to understand all of that, we need to pay attention to this new generation of political advocacy groups. And here again, I'm not just talking about MoveOn.org. I'm also talking about dailycoast.com, which is the largest political blog on the left today. It's a community blog. And by a community blog, what I mean is that anyone who shows up to that blogging site, if they like that community, if they want to participate in it, rather than just reading and offering things in the comment threads and then writing posts at their own site, they can register for their own account and offer up diaries, write diaries for that site. Daily Coast functions as a political association. The difference between a Daily Coast and a Sierra Club is a difference in, do you call the head of it the publisher, or do you call him an executive director? But in terms of what those organizations do, Daily Coast endorses candidates, they fundraise for candidates, they choose issue priorities and pursue them relentlessly during the legislative calendar. They actually even hold an annual in-person convention. Those are all the functions played by advocacy groups throughout history. Now we have new organizations playing them. We also have Democracy for America, which is an organization that was the old Dean campaign. And they have some features that are a lot like Move On, but what's most notable about them is that they also have these local units, what I call a neo-federated organization, that like the old federated organizations, if you're involved with Democracy for America in, say, Philadelphia, then what that means in practice is showing up to a bar about once a month for a meeting with your fellow Philly for Change activists and talking about how are we going to change things locally. So we've got a lot of different organizations with several variant structures. The one other thing that I would note is that all of these organizations that I'm mentioning here are concentrated on the left. Chapter 6 of the book is all about that. As with the book where it waits till the end, I'm going to offer a few slides at the end. There's a whole 40-minute talk that I like to give about why we see this left-wing bias. And since I don't want to spend an hour and a half talking to you, I'm instead going to give like 5 or 6 minutes of that. And then during Q&A, if you'd like, we can talk more about it. But the noteworthy thing is that it is not that we have left-wing Netroots groups and not right-wing groups because the right has decided not to try. In fact, what we've seen is both with the Tea Party, with organizations like Libertycom, SlateCard.com, and RedState.com, what we have seen is the right trying to emulate these Netroots organizations on the left. In fact, they usually call them out specifically by name. Liberty.com, which I'll talk about at the end of the talk, when they launched themselves, like many organizations before them, they said, we are going to be the right-wing answer to Move On. But when you look at what they actually try to do, they end up engaging in different practices, and they end up, for whatever reason, failing. That provides itself its own puzzle. But the reason why I focus on the left in this book isn't just because, as you can probably guess from my role with the Sierra Club, I myself am a progressive. The reason why I focus on the left is because the same thing is not happening on the right. And that provides its own puzzle for us to answer. So these Netroots organizations, what we've got here is 3 different ideal type models. And the first is the Move On style hub and spokes model, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But there you've got a central core staff, about 40 people, and then you've got a national membership of about 7 million. And the communication is primarily national organization to individual members, with very little communication amongst the membership. You've also got the neo-federated model, where you've got a national core, but most of the activity is happening amongst members offline in these face-to-face groups. So there you're seeing online activity supporting offline action. And the third model is the online community of interest, and Daily Kos is the classic example of that model. There you've got online member-to-member communication. So while there is a central core of about 12 to 16 people who are front-page diarists, and they have a national office in Berkeley, California, most of the activity that's going on Daily Kos is happening in those online diaries. And so that's a community of interest that's able to come together, because if you're a liberal in Nebraska and are really lonely, you can log on and go and engage with liberals in San Francisco and in Washington, D.C., and jointly engage in collective action. So those are those three models, though today I'm mostly focusing on this one. And that's because the main features of the Netroots are shared amongst these three different models. So let's take a closer look now at Move On. They were founded in 1998. It was actually originally an e-petition urging Congress to censure Bill Clinton and then move on, hence the name Move On. They were founded by two married tech entrepreneur couple, Wes Boyd and Joan Blades. Do any of you remember the old flying toaster screensaver?
Sure.
Yeah, so Wes and Joan created that. And they sold it for a lot of money, because we now live in a society where we get rich by coming up with things like flying toasters. And then after that, this is what they came up with to start next. That ends up being important because a lot of the innovations that they engaged in organizationally came out of the tech world. It really wasn't until 2002, 2003 that they emerged as the organization that we know today. In that first action around censoring Clinton and moving on, they got about 500,000 people who took action through their website, signing an e-petition through the website. But then after that, they didn't really have a lot of activity for people to engage in. In 1999, if you were a general progressive organization, it wasn't really clear what you needed to go work on. And then by 2002, 2003, it became dramatically clear, if you were on the left, what you were going to work on. And that was stopping the lead up to the war in Iraq. And they became a central organizing hub for people around the country who decided that they wanted to join this anti-Iraq war movement. They also got a guy named Eli Pariser then got involved. I don't know how many of you have read The Filter Bubble? Yeah, so he was executive director from 2004 till I think 2008, and then after that decided to write this really interesting book on tech. Now he's started Upworthy. He does everything cool, it seems. Another thing I want to clarify: how many of you in the room get Move On's emails? Okay, and how many of you are Move On members? Okay. What does it mean that you're a Move On member?
But I get the emails.
Right, exactly. Here's the truth. Since some of you have read the book, I feel like my punchline might be muted because of that. But yeah, surprise to the rest of you, congratulations, you too are a member. In fact, if you go back to your deleted folder and check out the most recent message they sent you, they said, "Dear Move On member," right at the top. So it's not that they haven't been trying to signal it to you, it's that none of us have really been paying attention. But that's one of the most important things that's gone on here, is they have redefined membership, and frankly, they've redefined it downward. They've decided that rather than membership being, I'm going to write you a check and then send it in, that now membership is just, hey, if we got your name and we can get in touch with you, we'll just call you a member. We'll just do it that way. That said, even though that is a weak tie there, those members still do a lot. In the 2008 election, those members donated over $90 million collectively to Obama and to support other candidates. They also, about 1 million of them volunteered about 20 million hours to help elect the candidates that Move On supported. And it's not all just online. They've got over 200 locally based councils. That's their version of the neo-federated model. That's 4 or more volunteers in any given city who come together locally to come up with what are we going to do as Move On in this area. So there is some neo-federated component to the organization. What's shocking to me, particularly from my experience with Sierra Club, is that they do all of this, again, with about 40 staff people and with no office space. That was one of Wes and Joan's key innovations, is what they called radical decentralization. They didn't want to have a central office and a bunch of satellite offices, because if you have water cooler conversation in one place, then again, organizational communication scholars know all of this, then you need to deal with, well, what do we do with the core periphery issue? And they said, you know what, thanks to the internet, we actually don't need offices. So here in DC, there are a lot of Move On staff. They can all go and hang out at the same coffee house, but they're not allowed to establish a Move On office. And that is an organizational rule, which has the nice byproduct of then they don't have to pay for any office space. That works pretty well. As an organization, what they engage in is not just the collectivism that they're best known for. So here's just one snippet example. Back in the 2010 healthcare fight, this was around the time that the Senate was about to vote on Obama's healthcare initiative. And on October 22nd, they sent out an email to the entire membership titled Official Move On Ballot. And that asked the membership whether or not Move On should take the really pretty strong stance that if a Democratic senator voted against the legislation, then Move On would support a primary challenge to that senator. They wanted to be able to they wanted to know if they should send a clear message to senators that this was a red line in the sand, and if you cross it, we're going to try to primary you. Perhaps not surprising, given the types of people who get attracted to Move On. It's left-wing activists. On Tuesday the 27th, they were able to announce, big news, 93% of you agree. That is perhaps not too surprising to us that left-wing activists, 93% of them who decided to vote, said, yeah, you know what, I'm going to be really mad if Blanche Lincoln cast that vote the wrong way. But notice what they follow up with, which is on Monday the 2nd, what they called the Healthcare Accountability Pledge. And there they said to people, listen, we don't have candidates yet, but we want to know what you would be able to put behind this primary challenge. So click here and sign up for how much money you would be willing to give to a primary challenger. And by Thursday, they were able to announce to Blanche Lincoln and other wavering Democrats, listen, if you cast a vote against the healthcare bill, we've got $3.5 million that we're ready to spend against you. That is traditional political power. That's not what Malcolm Gladwell calls collectivism. That's actual political power and might that weighs on a senator in their voting decision. And that's what they're able to engage in. And again, they're able to engage in it tremendously quickly. Turning then to these membership regimes. We don't have any undergrads in the room, do we? So somebody who still remembers their undergrad career really well. Were any of you members of a campus group when you were, a campus activity group when you were in college? Okay, so I'm going to ask you to play along. What did it mean to be a member of that group?
Yeah, it meant, well, it was a news organization, so it was part of my identity as being a Flash News reporter.
Okay.
That was my identity.
Okay, and so as part of your identity on a week-to-week basis, what did you do as part of that organization?
Go around and look for stories and report on them.
Were there meetings too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Weekly meetings, yeah.
Were there a lot of meetings?
When necessary, more than once a week, yes.
Okay.
With the editor.
Were any of you seriously members of campus groups that didn't have a lot of meetings? If you were, I would totally want to join that organization. So that is the traditional notion of membership, actually. If we look back, this is Theda Skocpol's book, Diminished Democracy. And this talks about this first change in membership regimes. That back prior to basically the 1960s, organizational membership in America was like campus group membership today. It involved showing up to meetings and participating. And that was, as you mentioned, identity-based. That forms an identity for the member. So you are a Rotarian, or you are an Elk, or you are a Sierran. Sierra Club was started in 1892, and so up through the 1960s, all of that organization, actually for up until the 1950s, in order to join the organization, you needed 2 members of the organization to sponsor you. And then that actually led, as a total aside, that led to a bunch of white members excluding black members, and their first executive director wanted to get rid of it. So he got it changed to you only need 1 person to say yes, and then he said yes to everybody, and that's how the organization switched that. But switching back to the real purpose here, that was what membership meant up until the 1960s, 1970s. And then we got a new type of membership. And what's important, and Skocpol mentions this but doesn't go very deep into it, is that change was a technologically mediated transition. We can only have the direct mail style membership, the armchair activism, when mainframe database computing gets cheap enough for nonprofits to be able to effectively make use of it. Before you can have membership by mail, mailing list management needs to be cheap enough for nonprofits to make a buck off of it. And that's happening in the 1960s, 1970s. And that's when the nonprofits, taking a page out of Sears and Roebuck's catalog, specifically their catalog, go ahead and follow suit and redefine membership. And say, okay, rather than membership being this thick tie that takes up a lot of time, I mean, all of us who were members of campus groups at some point dropped out of a campus group that we liked but didn't have time for anymore. And that's because the old style of membership was thick, it was costly, it took up a lot of our personal time and resources. And the new membership of writing checks, well, then you could belong to all the organizations that you could afford in your bank account to belong to. So that transition happened in the 1970s, and that spurred what in political science we call the interest group explosion. we got a huge new set of organizations in the 1970s. They were all single-issue professional lobbying organizations, mostly based here in DC. And what they did is they found members who would write checks, or they found foundations or major donors who would write bigger checks, and they used that to invest in lobbyists. They used that to invest in policy experts, and to trade on that in order to build some lobbying strength in DC. What we're seeing today is then a second membership regime change, where we've gone from the creation of armchair activism to the creation of what's now called collectivism, which is membership as an even thinner version. This is my big, busy chart because all social scientists, in case you haven't been told this, all social scientists must have one big, busy chart. So this is the big, busy chart, just charting the two different interest group revolutions. And the first is from these community-based or identity-based groups to the issue-based groups. That's guided by this rise in new fundraising regimes, which is the rise of prospect direct mail, patron donors, and grants. And notice what I'm going to suggest to you has happened with this move-on effect. We still have the patron donors and grants that we had before. We've just had a shift from prospect direct mail to online appeals. There's a new type of online fundraising that goes along with the new type of online membership. And that, again, gives us an organizational explosion, which also gives you a different type of organization. So now what we're getting is, instead of the single issue professional groups with big staffs and big office space in DC that costs a lot of money, what we're instead getting is these internet mediated issue generalists. And MoveOn is the most noteworthy of them, hence naming it after them. What's important to note about all these organizations is that they are sedimentary in character. What that means is that whereas the older professional organizations that were operating by direct mail, what they had to do was identify, they had to prospect. So they had to go out around the nation and find, if you're, say, defenders of wildlife, people in America who liked wolves enough that they were likely to write an annual check. And so you prospect around like you're prospecting for gold. You try to find other mailing lists, like, say, the Sierra Club's mailing list or the Environmental Defense Fund's mailing list, that are similar in character, so you have a higher return rate. And then you can remail to that list in the future, and from that make enough money to fund your organizing. So that was one in which you needed to prospect. Now what we see instead is sedimentary waves of activation. So Progressive Change Campaign Committee was launched in 2009, at first around Al Franken and then later around healthcare. But what happened with Al Franken is he had had a close enough Senate election that there was a legal challenge, and that legal challenge kept on going and kept on going. Norm Coleman had reached the point where he kept paying for that legal challenge just because that way the Democrats wouldn't get the 60th senator seated, which makes a lot of strategic sense for Republicans. You can see why, for their legislative strategies, that's a good idea to keep that going. And so these three activists, Adam Green, Aaron Swartz, and Stephanie Taylor, decided to start this organization. And what they did is they announced a $1 a day fundraiser where liberal supporters could pledge $1 or however many dollars per day that Norm Coleman kept up this challenge. And those dollars would go into a fund to help defeat Republicans in the next election. What they're doing there is a nice, savvy, small little tactic so that liberals, rather than saying, I'm angry, let me click an e-petition that doesn't do anything, well, instead they can say, I'm angry, and I'm going to create a real cost for the other side to continuing to delay things. So if there's strategic sense in keeping that delaying tactic going, it makes less strategic sense if it's also going to make the next election a bigger hurdle for you monetarily. And that was popular enough with liberal activists that it got forwarded around. And each person who took action in that one wave of activity, when the wave receded, when we were no longer focusing on Al Franken, well, they were left with a member list. And then when they turned to the public option on healthcare, when they turned to the Deepwater Horizon drilling, whatever was in the news that day, when they turned to that, that's where potential members' attention was. And then when the issue shifted afterwards, after that wave receded, they're left with a sedimentary member list of the list that's left behind. The other thing I want to note just quickly, one of the things that I did for the book was called the Membership Communications Project. Are you Luis, by the way?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so you've gotten to look at some of this data. Yeah. So with this project, what I did is I took a convenient sample of 70 progressive advocacy organizations, all of which had been listed in a book as the prominent ones that big donors give to. And I signed up with a dummy account for their email lists. And then I spent 6 months collecting their emails and content coding them. The secret to that, by the way, is lots of coffee. Like lots of coffee. And so then what I did is amongst those emails, I was able to distinguish trends. And one of the trends that became real clear is that everything that we hear from Malcolm Gladwell about how it's all e-petitions all the time, and well, actually, Stu Schulman argues that even more than Gladwell. That doesn't hold up to empirical scrutiny. What we actually see is, yeah, plenty of e-petitions, but also a lot of the classical actions that older advocacy groups usually take. There's also a lot of please email Congress or call Congress. There's a lot of please take local action. There's a lot of please donate through us to some candidate that's supporting our issues. They have a much wider palette for tactics than many of us are led to think. This is MoveOn's action request, so notice they spent as much time asking me, some random new member, to attend a local event as they did asking me to sign an e-petition. So turning now to fundraising, that chart looks weird. Turning now to fundraising, which is the other part of the MoveOn effect. There's a membership regime change and a fundraising regime change. There's three features of it that I view as being most important changes. The first is a change towards zero marginal cost scaling. What I mean by that is that there's a marginal cost for each additional piece of direct mail that you put in the mail. And that means that, again, what you're doing with direct mail at first is prospecting to come up with a concentrated list, and then you're just mailing to that concentrated list, because you would go broke otherwise mailing too much. The same is not true for email. Sending an email message to 10,000 people versus 9,000 people costs the same amount of money if you've already got those names. Adding an additional member, or adding an additional recipient, carries no cost. And that incentivizes organizations, again, to be generalists, to work on the issue of the day, to engage in this sedimentary mobilization, because when they engage in that activity, they get a bigger list, and there's no longer a cost to having too big and too diffuse of a list. That then leads to a second feature, which interestingly, even though this new type of membership is thinner, I would argue that it's got some real nice benefits. And they're what I call passive democratic feedback. So these new organizations engage in rigorous A/B testing of their messages. What we mean by that is that for every email that MoveOn sends, they first take a random segment of their list and send different versions of test messages. And from that, they're able to test and actually see, because they have records of what are you opening and what are you clicking through on. They're able to test what issue frames work better, what issue topics are more popular, what actions people are willing to take, what they're willing to actually do. And that voice of the membership, that data, allows for passive feedback where they can hear their membership talking on a day-to-day basis in a manner that organizations like Sierra Club just could not. The Sierra Club every 2 years was doing a biennial member survey where we would pay, it was 5 or 6 figures actually, I think, in order to pay someone to go do a big survey to find out what is the will of our membership. And once every 2 years, we would take on that cost. For MoveOn, they're able to do that on a daily, even hourly basis. And that's true for this entire new generation. So even though membership is thinner, they're actually able to hear better than we could decades ago. And then this last point, which I've already sort of driven home, is again this feature of headline chasing, that organizations are working on the issue of the day. As part of this membership communications project, for those 6 months, I also watched Rachel Maddow and Keith Olbermann every single night. Again, lots of coffee, it's very important. And what I found is that the new organizations compared to the old organizations spend much more time activating their membership around the issue that was on the liberal media that day, that night, or the night before. That makes sort of a simple logical sense that if your audience as MoveOn or as Daily Kos is pretty much the same people who are turning into Rachel Maddow, then you probably want to be working on the same things that the Rachel Maddow editorial staff are saying we ought to be covering today. That's what you're activating your community around and giving them an outlet for. Meanwhile, the other side of this, sort of the dark side of the MoveOn effect, is what it does to the older organizations. Prospect direct mail is an industry-wide freefall. This is something that I got to learn at first confidentially on the Sierra Club Board of Directors. It was an openly known secret amongst all the nonprofits, but it was all proprietary data, so scholars weren't able to look at it. Luckily, an organization called the Monitor Institute then went and did a bunch of interviews. They were backed by the big foundations, so people would talk more to them. And they were able to reveal these trends that we kind of all knew were going on and people were talking about at conferences. But there's a very simple reason. Prospect direct mail is an industry-wide freefall because people aren't paying their bills through the mail anymore. People are turning to online payment instead. And there's a difference in character between the targeted online fundraising that a MoveOn does and the type of fundraising that we're used to. So MoveOn.org's standard fundraising appeal is, here's a commercial we want to put on the air, take a click, look at it, and if you like it, give us $5 to put it on the air. That's a targeted appeal. And legally, you have to follow donor intent. So if you're raising money for a commercial, you have to put that money towards the production and the production of that commercial. If you're giving money to put it on the air, they have to use that money to put it on the air. They can't instead say, we're really glad we got all that money to put this commercial on the air. Now instead, we're going to have a big staff appreciation party, or we're going to pay the Human Resources Department a bunch of money instead. That's not a problem if you're MoveOn, because MoveOn does not have a Human Resources Department. The other organizations have a Human Resources Department of maybe one person. Other organizations have maybe one office. MoveOn has no offices. If you're Defenders of Wildlife, this is their office. I got to walk by it a few weeks ago. It's real near Farragut Station. That's a really cool statue of a wolf outside. They just love wolves. But if you're Defenders of Wildlife, I know how you were paying for that office in the 1980s and 1990s. I don't know how you pay for it today. And the problem here is that even though the patron donors and the foundations haven't gone away, those two funding sources have never really been all that willing to pay for big overhead and infrastructure. They don't pay for lots of field organizers. They don't pay for trainings departments. And so the types of things that the old organizations did particularly well for civil society, the infrastructure they provided, is now getting lost because this new type of fundraising doesn't pay for it so well. I sometimes give this talk to advocacy professionals, and so I'll ask them the group question, have any of you ever tried to do an online fundraising appeal for trainings? And one or two sorry hands will raise their hand, and I'll say, how did that go for you? And everyone will share a chuckle. Because again, one of the things that they know in the industry is that it's a lot easier to raise money to put a commercial on the air than it is to run a trainings department or run a field organization. That's just simply not popular. It's never been popular with the foundations, and now it's not popular amongst us small donors either. And since we have the freedom to give to individual things, we do. Yeah.
So can you legally say, okay, in order to get that commercial on the air, I have to have enough staff to make it, and there, X amount of my overhead costs gets built into that, because without that overhead, I couldn't get it to the air. Could you do that?
Legally, you can devote a percentage to overhead. And then we get into the gray area of what that percentage is. Actually, the tie-on question, which is even more interesting, is if we say we need $500,000 to put the commercial in the air, and it's a fantastic commercial and they give $5 million, what do we do with the $4.5 million? And that, again, is actually a gray area. We're currently in a moment where, since this new fundraising regime has just come out, the legislation around it and the law around it is pretty unclear. And so the practical answer is actually, if you're an organization that's been around long enough to be a target of IRS complaints, then you're very careful about it and you say, we can't use that money. And if you're a new organization that's never been threatened that way, then you probably have lawyers that say that you're a little bit freer on it. Again, actually, to invoke the Sierra Club as an example, the current nonprofit funding structure of 501c3 organizations and 501c4 organizations was, in a sense, actually created for the Sierra Club. In 1965, the organization's tax status was clouded because they took political actions around the Grand Canyon that was deemed too political. And it wasn't until 1968 that they passed a Tax Reform Act that created the current structure. We're currently in another one of those gray areas, like in the 1960s, where we don't exactly know what to do with the types of nonprofit activity that's going on. We see this most prominently in politics, where Karl Rove can call his organization a 501c4, even though it looks nothing like the traditional C4s like Sierra Club. That will eventually get clarified. My guess is that when it gets clarified, it won't make anyone happy. So depending on where you are as an organization, it's more or less dicey. But that's one of the potential workarounds in the short term. What this has meant in practice, these are two emails that I got sent actually on the same day in December 2008. What it has meant in practice is that it's not that the old organizations aren't using online fundraising. It's not that they're not sending emails. It's that they're using them differently. So this first message is from SaveOurEnvironment.org, which is the online outlet of an old environmental coalition. And what they say is, we have less than 40 hours to reach our goal of raising 10,000. A lot of reasons why you should give right now. First, because we're counting on you. Second, because the year is coming to a close. Third, because there's no time like the present. We have all heard this fundraising appeal if you bother to still open all of that mail that you get every day. If not, go through your junk mail pile that you haven't thrown out yet, and you will see almost this exact language in the junk mail that you just got from a bunch of organizations. They're good organizations. They developed this over 20 or 30 years of direct mail professionals honing the language that gets people to write checks through direct mail. What they've done is taken that direct mail and just put it online because, hey, zero cost marginal scaling. But notice what MoveOn does that same day. Dear MoveOn member, you've probably heard about how Wall Street financier Bernard Madoff scammed investors out of at least $50 billion, but you may not have heard that his victims included the foundations that support some really important progressive organizations. And they go on to say, we found a donor who will match these funds. Please give to help save these organizations that have been affected by Madoff. Again, what they're doing is surfing on the issues that were in the news the night before. People are much more likely to give when it's in reaction to the actions that are at the top of the head, to use John Zoller's term, than if it's just some generic appeal. We had to do the generic appeals back in the direct mail era because it takes 2 or 3 weeks to set up one of these mass mailings. Now that you're setting it up over the course of 2 or 3 hours instead, we're able to headline chase. I then also looked through this data set that I created of emails to look at the fundraising emails, and there were 350 of them in total over the course of 6 months. And I divided them by the age of the organization. So the organization was founded after 96, 98. The Center for American Progress was 68, 96, everything else was 98 or later. And all the other organizations in the data set were from 1993 or before. So on one side, we've got what I call the legacy groups, and the other side, we have the Netroots groups. Legacy is the red column. And so what we see is that these fundraising messages that they send are almost all these general appeals, taking your direct mail, putting it online, asking for money, which if donated can be used for anything. Then the blue line is the new organizations, the Netroots groups. Notice they do also send general appeals. They also need to pay for at least some human resources functions. And in particular, they're sending these after the big healthcare win, or after some other win. They send out a message saying, hey, we won. By the way, we do great work. Would you like to donate to us? And that's generally, I would imagine, pretty effective. The targeted fundraising, though, is almost entirely Netroots groups. The legacy organizations, though they're sending fundraising emails, are not sending the same type of fundraising emails. The other thing that we see is pass-through fundraising. This was pioneered by Emily's List, where it's donate through Emily's List to support a good candidate. This red column is almost pretty much entirely Emily's List. The only legacy group doing it is Emily's List, and there's, I think, one message from League of Conservation Voters. All of the rest is coming from these Netroots groups, particularly MoveOn and Progressive Change Campaign Committee. What they're doing is particularly around healthcare, saying, we found 2 champions, Jared Polis and Chelly Pingree, who are willing to support the public option. They've got a sign-on letter. So please join us in thanking them and donating to their campaign through us. That's a tactic. It's a very effective tactic of supporting your champions. And the new groups use it. The old groups pretty much don't, except for Emily's List. And so what we see, again, is this dramatic difference in how new and old organizations use technology.
I'm sorry, what was the right column?
The right column was total. So total number of fundraisers were pretty close to even between the two populations. This ties into Clayton Christensen's disruption theory. Christensen tells us, this is back in '97 from the business school literature, that there are 2 types of innovations that we see in businesses. And the first are sustaining innovations, the second are disruptive. Sustaining innovations are the types of innovations that are usually capitalized upon by large firms that already have big R&D departments. So they've got that advantage in there, and therefore they lead the way in innovations that help them to improve their existing services and product. Disruptive innovations are ones that undercut that market, that are a new market. And since it undercuts their market, those businesses tend to be surprised. We've also got, similarly, Pablo Baskowski's work from Northwestern, who finds very similar things about newspapers. So it's not the case that the New York Times just completely missed the internet. In the 1990s, Pablo documents how the New York Times was actively using the internet, but they were using it as a sustaining innovation. They were taking their headlines and their stories and just putting it online in a format that looked an awful lot like the daily paper. What we then saw, we now know in the media, is a news disruption story. It wasn't the bloggers that killed the newspapers. It was Craigslist. It was Google. And that's because it wasn't direct competition. More people are going to NewYorkTimes.com than were reading the New York Times back before we had the internet. The problem there is that when you undercut those markets through the degrading of revenue streams, then suddenly the big news organizations can't pay for all their infrastructure anymore. And that's where they run into the real problem. That's where you end up having the disruption that we have today. So the problem for the news environment isn't actually competition from Talking Points memo. And the problem for the ACLU isn't competition from MoveOn. The problem is these valued old organizations start running into revenue problems because how do we pay for the infrastructure that can no longer be paid for in the old ways? That's the story that we've now pretty well concluded is what happened in the news, and that's what I now see happening in the advocacy world. So to sum up this point, and then I want to talk for a second about the left-wing bias, then we'll turn to questions. But some of you may have read Bruce Bimber's work before, and if so, a lot of this should seem familiar. My work is heavily influenced by his work. And back in 2003, in Information in American Democracy, he was actually saying we're going to see the rise of new organizations, what we call post-bureaucratic organizations. He was also saying that we're going to see a whole new type of membership. So in a lot of ways, Bruce called it. The thing that wasn't in his book, and the thing that I'm adding to the picture, is this disruptive or generational character. In 2003, our general expectation, and Bruce's expectation, was that because of the internet, we would see organizations like Sierra Club and Environmental Defense Fund, EDF in particular was one of his main cases, leading the way in adopting new technologies and being the innovators. So the innovation would be a sustaining type of innovation. Instead, what we have seen, again, just from that MCP data set, is that while the old organizations are indeed using the internet, they're creating websites and blogs, they're using Twitter, they're using email, they're using it in different ways. And what we're seeing instead is the rise of these new sets of organizations that are becoming the center, the core of the progressive advocacy community. So that disruptive character ends up being important, particularly because as with the news media, I mean, I don't care too much if we lose a few advocacy groups. We've got a lot of advocacy groups out there. And I don't care if we lose a few newspapers, because there were a lot of newspapers already. In the news media, what we care about is losing local journalism, we care about losing investigative journalism, we care about losing international journalism. Those are public services that were provided by the old news system. And now, with the new infrastructure, the new ecology, we're left wondering, how do we provide for enough of these public goods? In the same way, in the old advocacy ecology, there were some public goods that were provided. And that was trainings for citizens learning democratic skills and getting involved in politics. That was field organizers who help people connect with their communities and organize for power. And all of that was stuff that we knew how to pay for in the old way, and now we don't know how to pay for. And so again, we face what I call the loss of a beneficial inefficiency. And we're in the process for the next few years of figuring out what that's going to mean and what advocacy is going to look like in the 21st century. It could be a lot of organizations just focusing on what you heard in the news the night before, or it could be a mix of those organizations and organizations who can sit down across the table from labor and hammer out a job contract. We're not sure what it'll look like yet. So then the last point that I want to make is that along with this old-new gap, we also do have this left-right gap. I looked in particular at this group called Libertycom, which announced itself in the summer of 2010 as the latest conservative move on. There's actually a string of these groups dating back to, I think it was 2004, that announced themselves as the next conservative move on. And usually if you look you see in the Washington Post coverage of this organization being launched, then you look 8 months later and you see coverage of the organization collapsing. It happened pretty regularly. So when this organization, Liberty.com, got launched, I signed up for the list and applied the same data analysis categories. That's the organization. What we find is that they're actually sending a very different text. Their email profile is very different. Most of the emails that they're sending are informational in character. What that means is that rather than saying, here's the issue that you heard about in the news, click here to take action and tell your friends, instead they're saying, here's the issue that just happened in the news or that the news isn't telling you about, click here to read a blog post about it. It's far less likely to build sedimentary waves of members if you're asking people to click here to read a blog post than to click here and take action and invite other people to take action. The only fundraising they were doing was general fundraisers. They actually were inviting people to pay money monthly to be a member. So they're using the old membership model. And the only targeted fundraisers they were doing were for ads to try to get Harry Reid out of office because they were running some electoral work in Nevada. So they weren't sending the types of headline-chasing sedimentary membership appeals that we see from the Netroots organizations. The other thing we see is that since that first election cycle, the fundraisers they have a pretty disturbing character. About half of their fundraisers over the past year or so have led with this header. Fellow Patriots, they say fellow Patriots rather than Dear Move On member. Please see the message below from, at this point it was Fisher Investments, but it's been other people as well. A paid sponsor of the Liberty News Report newsletter. These sponsorships help us provide Liberty News reports at no cost to you. They're selling their list. Now, sometimes they're selling their list to Rick Santorum because it's the primaries and Tea Party supporters are people who might really like Rick Santorum. There's really no ethical dilemma there. But what Fisher Investments is doing here is going on to explain how the entire stock market and economy is about to collapse. But if you click through and pay money, then they can give you stock tips to avoid the apocalypse. These are the same people they're the same types of people, and sometimes the exact same ones, who were the only ones left advertising on Glenn Beck after the sponsor boycott last year. He was left with Gold Line and with emergency seats. And honestly, having read a lot of these, I have no term for this. What's that?
Food insurance.
Food insurance, right. There's really not many ways to describe that other than a Ponzi scheme. Libertycom developed a list of people who I self-identify as Tea Partiers, and rather than providing them with opportunities to mobilize sedimentarily to take action, they're instead then selling that list off to people who figure they can make a buck off of them. And so unsurprisingly, they started with about 70,000 people. They've got about 70,000 people now. They simply are fundamentally different in character than what we see with the Netroots organizations. More broadly, though, we see those same patterns in online fundraising and in political blogs. The right has tried to emulate the left, and they have failed to do so. And this raises this big theoretical question of why. There are two main camps. Those of you who've read the book will notice I actually described 3 theses. I'm just giving the 2 big ones here for time. But the first is what I call ideological congruence. This is the claim that the internet is fundamentally a bottom-up or liberal medium. And the second is what I call out-party innovation incentives. I think both of them play a role, but I want to argue to you that we should take a step away from the ideological congruence thesis. 2 data points. The first, if we look to the UK, then during the same time period when the blogosphere in America was left-dominated, you had Daily Kos and you had Red State, and Red State was 1/10 the size at most of Daily Kos. The right was trying to emulate, and they just weren't able to. In the UK during that time, conservatives ruled the blogosphere. So now, conservatism in the UK means something different than conservatism here, but those ideological networks change over time. In fact, the one place where we've seen conservatives really succeed online is amongst Ron Paul supporters. So you've got this one sort of out-party bastion within the Conservative Party coalition, and that's where we've seen them really succeed online. So I find it difficult to say that it's a liberal medium if in some places conservatives do better than liberals. We should see that everywhere if that's the case. The other point I want to make is generally our understanding of the partisan adoption of technology. There's a story that we generally tell about talk radio, which is that talk radio is dominated by conservatives because there are all these working class conservatives who are driving to work. Actually, my cabbie on the way here was listening to Rush Limbaugh as he was driving me around. And so you got these working class conservatives who just want to listen to Rush Limbaugh, and there's no equivalent. Let's pause for a second. The last I checked, there are also working class liberals. So we don't actually have a good story of why talk radio is a conservative dominant medium, and it is. The left has tried to build their own infrastructure years later, and they failed to emulate. Air America went bankrupt at least 4 times, and I think it may have been a lot more than 4 times. And so what we see there is some other trend than just ideology explaining everything. It's teleological to look at a medium after one side has adopted it better than the other side and say, well, it must be because of ideology, because it just fits them better. Instead, what I want to offer up is this out-party narrative, which is that the party out of power has incentives at a number of different levels that make it easier for them to adopt new technologies or incentivize them to do so. So again, if we look at talk radio, Rush Limbaugh got his start in the late 80s, but he really didn't develop his massive audience until he had Bill Clinton to rail against. In the same way, MoveOn.org may have started during the Clinton administration, but it wasn't until they had Bush to rail against. And really, throughout those first 8 years of the 21st century, what they were doing is whatever Bush set the policy as, they were mobilizing against that. He set the agenda for them, and they were the place where the left could respond. Being able to respond like that, the way that a guy named John Henke from the right described it is, it's more fun storming the castle, so to speak. That's a Princess Bride reference for those of us who recognize the Princess Bride. That comment used to get all these jokes when I started giving this talk. It's been a few years now. It never gets a laugh anymore. I'm sad. But the point there is that it's also a better business model. We know from interest group history that organizational memberships and fundraising go up when the other party's in power. When Ron Reagan got elected president, Sierra Club's membership spiked. When George Bush the first was in office, membership spiked. Clinton goes into office, membership recedes. And that's actually something that we've known, that is as reliable as the tides. We've known it for a long time. So it stands to reason that if both sides in 2002 are trying to start new organizations, you would rather have the other side in office to rail against than be the party that is saying, hey, let's support this really big, complicated, messy process of passing some legislation. Also notice the Tea Party movement launches as taxed enough already as soon as we have Obama in office. The same people who launched that, Americans for Prosperity, were organizing for years, decades beforehand. But it isn't until they are the out party that they're able to capture grassroots enthusiasm at that level. So that's at the interest group level why it's easier. At the candidate level, we've known actually since 1974 with David Mayhew's work that members who are in great electoral danger are the ones who are more likely to embrace ostentatious innovation. If you expect to win your election, you're probably not going to try anything radically new. If you expect to lose, that's when you're going to try to change things. Notice if we look at the presidential races, which is where these innovations tend to most notably come from, because it's where we're all spending our money and paying attention. The three big internet candidates were John McCain in 2000, first person to raise $1 million. And we now know after the fact he wasn't sending his own emails, so it's not because of his own personal love of the latest things in Wired magazine. Then we have Howard Dean, who was what we call an asterisk candidate in 2003 when he started off, meaning that the number of people who knew who he was within the margin of error of 0. And so he again said, I got to change the rules, let's try this internet thing, brought in Joe Trippi. Then we have Barack Obama, who expected to lose to Hillary Clinton and said, I need to invest in the internet in order to challenge her in these primary and caucus states. And so he brings in basically Dean's old new media team in order to run things more effectively than they did last time. As an aside, a colleague of mine and Laura's, Daniel Kreis, has written a great book about that transition called Taking Our Country Back, which is network politics from Dean to Obama. It's a great addition to your syllabus if you haven't gotten to read it yet. But so at the party network level and at the candidate level and at the interest group level, we have this set of incentives that lead the party that's out of power to probably be better positioned, or yeah, not probably, to be better positioned in adopting new technologies. Consultants are usually the ones who are bringing those new technologies in. The party that's winning keeps hiring the same consultants. The party that's losing after a few cycles fires their consultants and hires new people. We saw with Obama is since Dems had kept on losing, he fires the old consultants. He doesn't hire Bob Shrum, and instead he hires the people who had worked on the Dean team, who had built Blue State Digital, who had built Echo Ditto, who had built a set of new consultancies that use technology appropriately. It's not that there are no Republican consultants who know how to use the internet well. It's that until 2008, they weren't getting the contracts because the other consultants were. Once those consultants lost, people like Mindy Finn and Patrick Ruffini, some of the leading, and John Henke, who are some of the leading Republican tech people, started getting more contracts. We saw in 2010 that all of a sudden Republicans were leading on things like Twitter and Facebook, the next wave of online innovations. This is just a short sketch of that theory. And that's actually going to be a much larger book project, tracking it over 50, 60 years of political history, to see if this partisan adoption story holds up over time. But if I'm right about that, that tells us something both about history and about the future. Historically, it means that we have a better explanation, finally, for why talk radio is the way it is, and why other technologies are the way they are. It means that the party that's out of power, when a technology is at that ripening diffusion point, sort of past the early, actually into the early majority stage, where people have taken it on at enough levels that you can use it in politics. The party out of power there is going to be the party that's more successful in bringing those technologies on, both at the interest group and the candidate and party network levels. That also then tells us something about the future. It means that if we have a President Mitt Romney starting in January, then we should probably expect the next wave of technology, of online technologies, to probably continue to have this left-wing character that we've come to associate them with. But if Barack Obama is elected for another 4 years, the expectation I would lay out to you is that by 2016, we're no longer talking so much about how the internet is a left-dominated medium. There probably still actually won't be a right-wing move on, but the next wave of technological innovations, the next, I don't know, maybe it'll be Pinterest, maybe it'll be the Google goggles or whatever. But when that starts getting used for politics, we should then probably see the right leading the way with that. More broadly, looking back to the broader move-on effect theory, where this is headed is a theory of analytics-based activism. That's going to be the next book project starting this summer, is looking at how email analytics, this passive democratic feedback, informs organizations, what they can use that for, and what questions they can't answer with it, and what that does to the decisions they make, the tactics they use, and how we engage in political advocacy in America. The other main point I want to make is, again, about disruption theory. The thing that we need to figure out, both as scholars and for practitioners who are reading this book and thinking about this subject, is what happens to the functions that old organizations knew how to provide, we don't know how to provide anymore, and provide a public good for political engagement in America. Ideally, the ideal organizations that Theda Scotch-Paul talked about in her book were these federated civic organizations that acted as laboratories of democracy, that both allowed citizens to meet their neighbors and learn civic skills. Once we started getting those direct mail organizations, she points out we lost a lot of that character. It's possible with like neo-federated organizations that the internet will help us to bring some of that back. But so far what we've mostly seen instead is this national online mobilization with very little support for this type of face-to-face engagement, which is still slow and costly. Those decisions are still being worked out. They're being worked out by advocacy networks and by funder networks. And so we'll see in the next few years whether they make the investments of time and energy and resources and money in order to build organizations that do those hard things that otherwise aren't provided for in the new fundraising economy. That's the thesis, and I'd love to hear what you think.